Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Monga. I am serving as governor for Issaca Orange County chapter. Today, I have Bruce with me. Bruce, why don't we start with a quick introduction?
Yeah, my name is Bruce Phillips. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for the Williston Financial Group of Companies. We're a national title insurance underwriter.
So, Bruce, this year, I know CCPA became more eyes on, I should say. It started last year, but this year it became more eyes on from attorney perspective, from organizations perspective. So this session, we want to cover a couple of things about CCPA implementation. Since you have successfully implemented in your organization, we want to get some insights from you. Why don't we start with the simple question? Why did your organization consider to be in compliant with CCPA?
Well, it was really simple. We do a lot of business in California, and without even looking at CCPA, when they first said they were going to start up with a privacy regulation in California, we already knew that we probably had everything that they were going to think about, and then some of the things that they probably haven't thought about yet. We had, because we basically, as part of what we're doing, we do escrows when everyone buys a house. So you can think of all the information that you provide your lender. Well, we get a copy of that, and we have to use that when we go in and complete the transactions. So that was sort of the genesis of it. And as we looked through that and sort of looked in sort of the future lens, we said, while this is California only, we're going to adopt CCPA as the basis for all of our organization, regardless of what state we're in, because it's going to be coming anywhere else. GDPR sort of kicked it off in California, brought it in, very similar with that, and we knew it was going to go someplace else. So we actually use that as the model for our privacy going forward.
And I know a lot of organizations still have questions about if they are based out of, let's say, other state other than California, do they still have to worry about CCPA? And I think we covered that during our CCPA event in November last year. Even though you're based out of different state, if you do business in California and if you're dealing with data for Californians, you have to worry about CCPA. How does that play out in your organization?
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you look at it, because CCPI, the way it's written is that if you are dealing with citizens of the state of California, then they get that expectation, so it sort of covers you. Now there's a lot of financial limits that you have to meet and volumes that you have to meet. You're 100% correct. Even if you are not domiciled in California, if you are doing business within the state of California and you're dealing with information from consumers in California, then the consumer has that right, and you sort of have to meet that obligation. And for us, it was really interesting because when you're looking at doing an escrow when someone buys a house, they may be a citizen of California buying something in Oregon using our Oregon operations, but they have that expectation that they're covered under California. So it gets a little bit complex when you start looking at that, and then you start looking at the lens of the other privacy regulations that are coming about. That you really can't just take a myopic view of say, I only, I'm in Nevada. Why do I care? You're going to care sooner or later, whether because you're going to have enough volume of people from a state that's covered by something like CCPA, or Nevada is going to roll in with what they're going to do, and it's going to be very similar. And then the other thing that we looked at when we took a look at how are we going to address this early on was that there's a reason for CCPA, just like there was a reason for GDPR, and that reason was the consumer expectation. Right, consumers are getting more aware. They're getting smarter about who's using their information and what are they doing it for. And now there's an expectation that consumers are looking for this, even though if there's not even a regulation in their state. So our initial thought was, well, we're not gonna worry about whether or not there's a CCPA like regulation in one state or another. We're going to set the bar where we think the consumer wants it, and then that's how we're going to deal with privacy.
Since you're out of the curve already and you have implemented CCPA, for organizations who have not started, and I really hope so that everybody has started, but let's just assume there are a couple of organizations who have not started, what would be the first step of CCP implementation planning?
Well, the number one thing is you got to understand what data you collect. That's the number one thing, right? Before you can do anything, you have to understand what it is you're collecting. And then from that, where's it at? And then what you're doing with it. And that's sort of going to frame the things that you're going to have to worry about, and then being able to respond, right? Because the very first question out of that a consumer can ask you out of CCPA is, what data do you collect about me? So once they ask that question, there's a time limit that gets started. You have to respond. And if you don't know what you're collecting, it's going to be really hard to make your time limits. So the very first thing you need to understand is, what data are you collecting? And then you need to understand, where is that data? And then the last thing you need to understand is, what are you doing with that data?
I think that's the key. What are you doing with that data, right? So if your organization has the data and they don't understand how that data is being used and where it's being used, I think that can get complicated pretty fast.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest complication you're going to find out, is, if you're collecting data and you don't know how you're using it, and it turns out that you're using it in such a way that the consumer doesn't want you to do, and it comes back, they find out at the end of the day when you say, I don't use it, but you do, then you have liability, right? Because you have to be able to answer those questions. That's the thing that most of these privacy laws that are coming in is being able to explain what information you collect and what you're doing with it. And if you don't know, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. Make sure you know how your data is being used and where it's being used. So, Bruce, when people or organizations start planning for CCP implementation, one of the biggest things that they always ask for the challenges, right? What was your biggest challenge, or what would you think is a common challenge that an organization has to face when they start talking about CCP implementation?
It all comes down to the data. There's sort of a two-prong that I answer to that one. Number one is really finding out what you're collecting and who's using that data and what are they using it for. For years, everyone thought data was free. There's always been ways of figuring out how to not monetize anything that you get. And then, people are just, creating their own cloud infrastructures to be able to handle data, and understanding where all this data lives and what all that, what it all is and what you're doing with it is probably the most complex and challenging thing you're going to do, because you got to find all the people that are using the data or reusing the data for something else. Data has always been has a tendency to flow like water. It goes anywhere because everyone wants to use it, and you lose track of it. And now you have to come back, and depending on the age of the organization, you may have years worth of people using data in ways that no one really understands. And the people that set it up aren't probably there anymore, right? And now you have to backtrack. So that's really the big challenge. And the only people that can answer that is not IT. It's the people that can answer that is the business. Well, the business wants to do what the business does. They don't want to come back and answer these questions. So that's the biggest challenge is getting champions within the business to help as you express what it is you need to get done and then drive to that common goal. And so that's the number one thing. The other part of that challenge is in all of these things, we don't have the technologies to do what a lot of the regulations want you to do. And so that means that there's a technology component to this that you're going to have to figure out. One of the interesting things that if you understand just the basics of what you have to do within the regulation, is you have to be able to say what data you collect, what do you do with it, and you have to have them the ability to say, I want you to delete my data. Well, think of all the systems we have. Most of our systems aren't designed to selectively delete data about an individual. So now you have to figure out how you're going to get to that part of the regulation so that you can meet that. And then if you're in GDPR, the portability issue, I don't think that's in CCPA, so you don't have to be able to send the data to someplace else, but it may show up in another state. So that's another thing that you have to worry about, is making the data portable.
Yeah, so you touched upon the technical changes and the technical things that we need to worry about, or at least have to tweak for CCPA. What would you say in order to start planning and in order to consider it? How many changes or how much would it be for technical changes for CCPA in regards to CCPA project?
It's going to depend on the systems you're using, but just everyone I've talked to, it's been a larger technical problem than that they thought, because of this idea of being able to delete data and to specifically delete specific rows of data, right? Depending on how you collect data. And that's where the challenge is going to come in, especially if you're in an industry that has been collecting data for years and you're using older technologies. There are people that are still using COBOL because it works and it always works. So now how do you then take that, where you probably don't have the people who really understand the system, and be able to backfit that system so that it can meet the requirements. So that it really depends on the technologies you're using. And some of it can range from very minor to extremely difficult. And then it comes down to, you have to understand the regulations and what it allows you to keep and not keep, and what you can and cannot do. So it gets a little bit really convoluted when you start thinking of the things that have been put into some of these regulations. The greatest example of this is, according to CCPA and CPRA, is your IP address is consumer information. So if a consumer comes to you and says, well, I want you to delete everything, you have to delete their IP address. Now think about that, every place that you collect an IP address, and the fact that, how do you validate that piece of information is about that consumer, not about another consumer? Because we all know that IP addresses for consumers are not static. They're delivered just like in a corporation, DHCP. So you get a lease, and it's only your information for a period of time. And so those type of things get into the technologies that you have to do, can be really, really tough to meet those requirements.
With IPs, and if let's say an organization is actually using IP for, I don't know, reputation, or they make sure that's how they're serving a customer, how do you delete an IP and then still serve the customer? So then at that point, they really need to be ready how to respond to that kind of request.
So that's where you come into understanding what data you're collecting and what are you using it for. Because if you have a valid business justification for retaining that data, you can retain the data. But if you have not understood and documented every piece of consumer information as defined by CCPA, and included that in your privacy policy, and articulated why you keep it, and have a good business justification why you can't delete it, then you have to delete it. So that's where it gets really complicated, to understand the regulation and to understand the data that you are collecting, and then understand what you're using that data for. For us, we collect your IP address. We use that for fraud prevention. And if we were to delete that IP address, we would no longer have the ability to do fraud prevention. That is articulated in our privacy policy. Therefore, if you were to come in and say, delete my data, I don't have to delete your IP address. I just have to, and so that's how you get around that. But it's not something that is easily sussed out and then figured out. So it gets complicated when you start looking at regulations and competing regulations, and then understand that this idea of consumer information was created by lawyers. They don't understand the technologies. They don't understand what we're trying to accomplish. So we have to be able to articulate what we're doing, and it gets challenging.
Now, you brought up a point of lawyers, so I have to go there. How much legal involvement has to be considered for CCPA implementation? Like how many meetings you had to go, or in the initial planning, how much had you budgeted legal work into it?
Well, when we initially started, it sort of dovetailed. So it's really hard to answer that question really well. So we started with GDPR and saying, does this affect us? What are the requirements? And so there was, multiple meetings with general counsel, with compliance counsel, with external counsel on understanding the regulation and how it affected us. And it just seemed like it went right from that into CCPA in sort of the same thing, where initially it was just myself, compliance counsel, and general counsel. We met about once a month and discussed what we were learning as the regulation was being sort of drafted before it even became law. And during in interims, we were attending any type of conference or meeting we could find that was talking about what was happening. And then I sat in on a lot of the legislative systems or discussions on as they were building it, and then following up with when they were doing the second half of before it first went implemented, when they said, here's the fixes that we have to do because this thing was drafted sort of really quickly. So it started out where it was monthly. And then when it got closer and closer and we sort of saw what CCPA was going to look like, we ended up having between myself, general counsel, compliance counsel, a couple other people in compliance, underwriting attorneys, litigation attorneys, and a handful of business people. We were meeting at the beginning weekly to go through and understand and put together what our program was what our new privacy program was going to look like. And then from that split off a bunch of other working groups. One of them is, we decided really early on that the most important thing to do at the very beginning was to create a data map, which is understanding what data we have, where's that at, who collects it, why do we get it, and what are we doing with it. It's something that, you sort of had for years, if you've ever done litigation support, where you had sort of a subset of that. But the piece that was always missing is, well, what are you doing with it? And so that sort of splintered off. So overall, it was a several month process. At the end, we were meeting weekly status reports. I don't want to even think about what the cost was. It was expensive to do that.
Yeah. So you mentioned data map and how the data is being leveraged. So one critical things when we discuss data maps is backups. Our production, making sure we are safe, we have disaster recovery and high availability. We're writing everything to backups and backups and backups. How does that work out in this compliance when someone asks, or let's say a customer asks me to delete something and I go and do selective deletion? How does that trickles down to backups?
Yeah, it's so, there's really no way to go into a backup and, delete a single row out of a database in a backup of everything that you're using, right? The technology just doesn't exist. But it's not something that's accessible, then it's not something you're using. So what you have to look at, and it's just like when you come out and you say, I want you to delete my data, if I have competing regulations that says, I can't for another regulatory reason, but if that regulatory reason has a time limit on it, so let's say I have to keep your data for 7 years for some transaction that you've done with us, and you come into me at year 1 and say, I want you to delete my data, we can say, okay, we can't right now, but 6 years from now, we'll delete it. There's a challenge there, right? Now you have to have a system that keeps track of all those requests for people that have said, please delete my data, and whether or not you fulfilled it, or if you didn't fulfill it, when you can fulfill it. And you have to put a process in place to be able to periodically look at that list and say, oh, I can now delete this data from these people. And so that's a system that people really haven't thought about. That's a sort of a hidden gotcha. The good news is there are regulatory reasons why you don't have to delete the data. But once that regulatory reason goes away, you have to then delete the data. And that timer started when they asked you to. You don't have to, and so that's where the challenge is. So now you have to extend that and say, okay, so now someone has asked me to delete data. I have met that requirement for regulatory keeping of that data. Now I've deleted that data. Now a year later, I have a catastrophic failure and I restore from a backup. Now I have to go back through my list and ensure that none of the people's data that we originally deleted are included in that backup. So once you restore everything, then you got to go back through and find all these people and make sure they're not there anymore. So it builds another process around how do you manage data. So data management becomes a little bit more of a problem because now you have to understand who's requested what, when they requested it, and when you fulfilled it. But then you can't just forget about it because depending on how old your data can be, if you can restore that data at some point, then you have to re-delete that data from the restore. At some point, hopefully you're not keeping data in, that will fall off and then the requirement can fall off. But you can see that now you have to build a process that manages data at the individual consumer level.
So it seems like organizations have to have data map along with customer request map to align, because every time customer requests, the clock starts.
Yes.
So it's not like I can have every calendar year or every monthly. It's literally the customer, as soon as they request, the clock starts.
Yes. And so you have to have a system that can manage that, right? So that you have to be very easy for the consumer to be able to ask the questions, right? And the questions they can ask, number one is, what data do you collect about me? That's the first question that they can ask. And it could be anyone. Have you collected any information about me? I have to say yes or no, right? And I have a time limit that I have to be able to say that and answer those questions. And then they can actually come back and say, so show me the information you collected about me. And now there's a time limit for that, but now you have another problem because you have to be able to validate that the person asking to see their data is actually that person. And it gets really complicated and in some of the examples they discussed when they were writing the regulation was, you don't want to tell the spouse information about the other spouse, because what if they're going through a divorce and they're just hunting for information? So you have to make sure that you're answering the right questions to the right people. And then how do you validate that? And then that sort of says, well, I'm going to use out of wallet questions, right? Your mother's maiden name, where you went to high school. Well, those aren't valid because your spouse may know that information. So how do you prove that you're not releasing that information to the wrong person? Because as soon as you release it to the wrong person, you've just violated the privacy regulations. And then the third thing is, in CCPA is, please delete my data. And in the same thing, those last two questions are really, really sensitive in that, what if it wasn't you that asked me to delete your data? Maybe it was somebody who just wanted to mess with you. So there's a lot of onus upon the business to ensure that the person making those requests is actually the person that is allowed to make those requests. And you can't make a system that makes it impossible for people to satisfy those requests. So, it gets really touchy when you do that. And how are you going to do the verification and the validation of the requests? So that's, I think, from an implementation standpoint, that's difficult. And I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. Please contact your lawyer and figure out how you're going to do that. Because that's a tough thing to do. That once we got to that part, that was the most complicated system we had to build. And how do we meet the requirements of the regulation is that you can do this and we can't make it impossible for you to do, but at the same time, you can't release it or delete it because of the wrong person. That's
I can see how it gets complicated pretty fast.
That one brings back nightmares. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sure you get this a lot, but a lot of times we hear organizations that are using native cloud or private cloud services, and they're like, yeah, we saw the CCPA compliant sticker on that flyer. So that means, do I not have to worry about CCPA compliant because the cloud itself is compliant? How does that work out?
Yeah, ignore that sticker. That doesn't mean anything. What it really means is they have systems in place that means that they, the cloud service provider, are CCPA compliant. It doesn't mean you and your data is CCPA compliant, because they don't manage your data. You manage your data. Therefore, you have to put the controls and everything in place to be able to manage your data. So that's the challenge. Now, if you're looking at a SaaS application, it's sort of the same thing. How do you then respond to the question, right? Because the SaaS application may or may not want to talk to your customer and answer those questions. And do you want the SaaS provider talking to your customer? And then third is that if you're relying on the SaaS provider to do that, what happens if they don't meet the timeline? Because at the end of the day, the consumer is your customer. They're going to sue you. What is your relief with your SaaS provider? So, once again, you have to say who's managing the data, and then who is it that you want interfacing with your consumer, and then lastly, what are the contractual requirements that protect you? But at the end of the day, you got to remember that they don't care that somebody else is running the application. It's your brand protection. SaaS applications, cloud-based infrastructure, all that stuff is really cool, but it does not relieve you from the responsibilities. And it opens you up to having your brand take a hit because someone else, and it's not their brand that's going to take the hit. And even if you try to tell everybody, but they're supposed to do it. No, it's your consumer, it's your brand. You have to protect your brand. So just going to the cloud doesn't relieve you of the responsibility of having the processes and the privacy policies in place to follow the regulations.
What? I'm making my sarcastic face. I thought a cloud will solve all my problems. I'd never have to worry about anything. Just burst the bubble.
Yeah, surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is, but you got to think about it even from that higher level, right? The consumer doesn't care where or who's managing the data that you're using. It's their data. They gave it to you. So at the end of the day, it's a brand issue, right? Yep. And the same thing when you take a look at any potential regulatory issues, you're the one collecting the data. Therefore, you're responsible, and you're responsible for the regulation and meeting the regulation. It doesn't make any difference if it's on-prem, it's in the cloud. It's your responsibility. You have to have the privacy policies in place and the procedures in place to be able to answer the questions that consumers are asking.
Yeah, but the organization or the private cloud might have good controls to protect your, as a consumer data, about what you're using the private cloud to manage your consumer data. That's up to you, how you manage. It's layer underneath layer.
That's the best way to put it. Layer under layer. Let's go back to the lawyer discussion.
Yeah.
Really have to have your lawyers have to be educated on what to look for. And anything you do in the cloud is nothing more than a contractual relationship.
Yep.
And anytime you're in a contract, get a good lawyer to understand the terms and conditions of that contract, and so that helps protect you.
So we talked about planning, we talked about technical challenges, we talked about data backup. Wrap up this session with this simple question: how do we know when an organization is CCPA compliant? We did all of that planning, we did implementation, technical challenges, legal meetings. How do we know at the end when we are compliant?
Yeah, that's really the hardest question, right? There's two prongs to this. I am a firm advocate in self-assessment, and you look at yourself with a critical standpoint. Don't look at what you think you're doing. When you get to what you think you're close to the end, then go back and take a look at it and ask those questions and see how, if someone can do this. Do a control self-assessment. Understand if your controls are actually working and you can meet the requirements. And then you have to periodically review those, right? Things like the very beginning, we say you have to do a data map. You have to understand your data, what you're doing with your data, where's your data located at, all of this other cool stuff about data. That's not a one-time thing. A data map is a living, breathing entity. You should review your data map periodically, depending on the size of your organization and how fluid you are. Is that quarterly? Is that annually? You have to make that decision and make sure you understand the ramifications of getting it wrong. But you're never going to be done. As soon as you think you're done, that's when the gremlins will come out. Someone will do something because someone just got hired and they thought this was a good idea and they didn't ask the right questions and we didn't ask the right questions of them. And now you find out you are no longer compliant in this part of your business because of a decision that someone makes. So that's why you have to periodically review, periodically redo your data maps, test yourself. And if you're really paranoid, I know there are companies out there that will come in and do a CCPA or CPRA or GDPR assessment, get their opinion, right? A couple of different ways you can do it. At a minimum, you should be always reviewing yourself, periodically redoing your data map. And then from there, as long as you document that. The other problem will be, you have to do the due diligence. There's no one that's going to be 100% perfect, and everyone knows that. But if you're not doing anything, that's the people that are going to get into trouble. And I just today saw our first actual action on CCPA. It was a $400,000 fine. So that was interesting. I thought the timing was really interesting, knowing that we were going to do that. Yeah. And the first thing on my inbox this morning was a $400,000 CCPA fine that was actually upheld by the federal courts in California.
I think key takeaways from this session: first, data map. Make sure you know what kind of data you have and how are you using it. I think that would be the key. Second, train your technical and legal teams and put them on the same table. Make sure they are exchanging. And the final part is, it's not a one-time thing. You need to keep monitoring. You need to keep auditing yourself. As Bruce, you mentioned, self-auditing. Don't just stop at one.
Yep.
Bruce, it was an amazing session with you. Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation.